choose your... Weirdly, I think that's how I imagined you in that order when I was preparing my questions, which is very odd. Could you each just say a hello in the microphone so that we know that it's working okay?
Hello, hello. Hello.
Hello.
Brilliant.
Did you hear us?
Okay.
Does that work okay?
Lovely. So thank you all for coming. I'm Jess, and it is such a pleasure to be here with three incredible humans. Just to give you a wee bit of background to this event. So it's called Read, Think, Act, which is a bit of a, I guess, ethos for the shop, for Lighthouse. And it's also the name of a video series that we do where we ask authors to really dig into what happens when you leave the page. How do books actually change people, and how do they change the world? Because very often it's something that gets said, but how does that happen, and what may be slight complications with it in a world where there is a publishing industry that is profit-making and things like that. So this today is just it's a wonderful chance to really dig into these things with people who are incredibly creative, but also engaged in different social justice struggles and issues. So it's a really, really wonderful chance and a huge pleasure to be here. Just to introduce them, so we've got Yasmin El-Rifae, who's a writer, editor, and producer of the Palestine Festival of Literature. Her first book, Radius, which is right there in the middle, it's absolutely amazing, was published by Verso in 2022. Her work has recently appeared in the New York Times, Lux Magazine, Madame Masr, and other outlets. We've got Yara Rodriques Fowler, who's a writer from South London. Her first novel, Stubborn Archivist, was published in 2019. Yara's second novel, There Are More Things, which is there, also really, really wonderful, was nominated for the Orwell Prize for Political Fiction in 2022 and Goldsmiths Prize 2022. She's also a part-time climate justice organizer. And then on the far end over there, we've got Phil Wrigglesworth, who's an illustrator, educator, art director, and independent magazine publisher. He co-founded Left Cultures with Colm Leith in 2021, and we've got copies of Left Cultures, which is really wonderful to look through, so definitely take the chance to do that if you haven't. And is to celebrate all forms of culture creation on the left through personal storytelling and to champion expressive illustration. A huge round of applause, please, for our speakers. So let's dig in to give you each a bit of a chance to kind of situate us where you stand in this relationship between creative output and writing and expression and social justice and taking action in the world. I wanted to just invite you each to talk a little bit about your work, to introduce us to your work and its relationship to social justice organizing and to activism. And maybe if there's anything at this particular moment that you kind of thinking a lot about or struggling with, or if there's any conflict there, anything that you think we need to spend some time thinking about. Would you like to start, Yasmin, just because you're on?
Because I sat where you thought I would sit.
Exactly.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the invitation to come and be part of this wonderful book fair. It's not my first time in Edinburgh, but it's my first time at this book fair, and it's wonderful to be here. Wonderful to be here with you guys. So I have, in the last sort of 10 or 15 years, I've worked as a journalist and a writer, an editor, a human rights researcher, a press freedom researcher, and I've also helped organize the Palestine Festival of Literature since 2013. And it's only recently sort of become clear to me that while my sort of jobs and even career paths have changed in some ways multiple times, they tend to sort of circulate around trying to pull out or make visible or articulate some kind of suppressed speech or reality or injustice or violation. during the revolution in Cairo, I helped organize my most sort of active involvement in the revolution was with this group called Operation Anti-Sexual Harassment and Assault, which my book Radius is about. And this was essentially a militant feminist intervention group that was pulling women out of mass assaults that were happening in the protests in Tahrir Square. And I wrote the book in an effort to sort of, to both document the history and to try and tell it in a useful way, right? To try and make it a useful history. To sort of reveal some of the complexities and the difficulties of the work that was done on the ground and what it was like for people to live in the aftermath. And I sort of thought of the book as a way of documenting that history, documenting different people's and narrating different people's experiences and reflections on this work that they'd done and this experience that they'd had, and also trying to open it up to to bigger questions about political organizing, about feminism, about revolution, and of course now I'm thinking of useful histories in a different light, and I'm turning to them and trying to read them and find them as a way of in some ways as a way of dealing with what's happening in Palestine right now, which is where my mind, I can't even say it's at the forefront of my mind. My mind is very much fully consumed with this. And that's part of why I've written down some notes. I'd rather just be here and chat on the fly, but I sort of felt I needed to organize some of my thoughts here. And the reason I'm talking about useful histories in this context is because I really think that in order to fight and to deal with this genocidal violence that's being inflicted on Palestinians, we have to understand its history in order to understand what it is. Like, nobody who's been paying attention to what's happening on the ground in Palestine or to what the Israeli government has itself been saying for many years now is, I'm not going to say we were all shocked, right? We're all shocked, but you can see how it is the culmination of a project, and it is a violence that has, the ground for this has been laid very carefully and internationally for years, for a very long time. And it can only, what's happening now in Gaza and in the West Bank and across historic Palestine, this kind of eliminatory violence that's happening completely nakedly with all of the world witnessing, with so many of the world's structures, of media, of government, of finance, of weaponry, either turning a blind eye or willfully enabling it. This can only come because we've already normalized all of the atrocities leading up to it. We've normalized Gaza being besieged. We've normalized people in Gaza being bombed from the skies periodically. We've normalized Gazan death. We've normalized the mass killing of children and the complete ungrievability of Palestinian men, and so there's sort of, when I think about words and the relationship between words and action in this moment, I'm thinking of it on these two levels of the need to access and know these useful histories. And there is, one of the gifts of Palestinian history and Palestinian struggle is that they have been extremely prolific in writing and publishing and editing, and many of them from a very internationalist perspective as well, right? Like always connecting to other struggles. So there are so many things to reach for, and maybe we can talk in more specificity later on. But I'm also thinking of words and discourse and narrative and our position in the West, in or near the metropoles vis-a-vis the institutions that are using words and using discourse to either deny or, again, explicitly enable this violence? And how do we position ourselves? You know, many of us, and I, mostly write and work and publish with sort of alternative or lefty platforms that consider themselves on the margins, right? Like, we consider ourselves to be critical, we're pushing back against the mainstream. And I think that, you know, that is always useful, and there's a responsibility in those spaces to be publishing, you know, militantly and critically in this moment. But we also have a responsibility, just because of our geographic position, to push back against the mainstream institutions that are actively complicit, whether that's governments or media or, you know, academies that are suppressing speech and threatening students. And there's a lot of work to be done. I mean, I don't know, yesterday, a group of writers and journalists and activists flooded the lobby of the New York Times in New York and stood in protest and, you know, held a rally outside of that newspaper. So there are direct actions like that, but there are multiple levels of work to be done. I don't want to take too much time just off the top talking about that, but there is, I guess I'm thinking of this, the sort of the multiple ways in which, from our position as, you know, leftists, to call it broadly, we are really responsible to both use the spaces that we've created as alternatives, but also to really push back in this moment, because, you know, I'm sure, you know, this is not an audience that needs to hear this at length, but what's happening in Palestine will not end in Palestine. Like, if this, and it's not going to stop on its own. This is only going to stop if the world makes it stop. And if the world doesn't make it stop, we are very quickly going to be dragged back into you know, an epoch in which just naked colonial violence against people who can be othered, of which there are many, will just be the norm. So yeah, that's where I am right now vis-a-vis your question.
Thank you, and that is such an important point as well, in terms of just because you might engage with outlets that are, as you said, on the margins, doesn't mean that you don't have a responsibility to challenge the mainstream. Yeah, that's a really good point. What about you, Yara? Give us a wee bit of background.
Yeah, I think, like, probably if you'd asked me, like 2 months ago, a month ago, my answer would have been different. I was in a completely different place in my mind. Yeah, and like us together even, but I feel like I've been organizing like crazy in the last month because of the genocide in Gaza. And yeah, like I have my approach to writing fiction that I think is radical or liberatory, which is that the novel is, you know, when you open a novel, you agree to spend this extended period of time doing imaginative work. And so it, like, the duty of the novelist is to expand the political horizon of the reader, if you want to do. Particularly in the UK, you know, what neoliberalism does is it reins in the political horizon and tells you, oh, you can ask for a slightly cheaper tuition fees in Scotland or something. You couldn't possibly ask for, you know, a ceasefire or, you know, whatever. So I think that is the spiel that I would always give about my approach to fiction and novel writing. And a different approach might be needed in a different context, but I think in the UK right now, that to me is what makes the most sense. But I think in terms of more broadly as writers, I feel at once that, yeah, our writing can do this important work of expanding the imagination or sharing information that has been suppressed. But I also feel like there is such a complacency amongst writers in the UK, in the global north, probably more generally, but obviously I know the UK context the best, that just by doing any writing, we are doing something important and radical. And I think, and therefore, you know, there's no materialist analysis of like, oh, well, if you want to change the publishing industry, or if you want to make a statement as workers, you need to go via your trade union. There's so little just analysis and understanding of how you actually get anything done. So something that me and Jess have been talking about is like going to our trade union and getting some kind of pro-Palestine motion passed. And there just isn't much of a tradition of writers in the UK doing that. And I don't know whether it's because it's like so middle class and exclusionary or like what, but so I find myself at once believing in the potential and the possibility of the novel and of the imagination and fiction as something that can do political work, and also so frustrated and exasperated with other writers, not to mention obviously the publishing industry, which is consolidated to hell and just there for profit, like the mainstream ones. I think the reason that's foremost in my mind, and I'm so kind of frustrated and tired because of the moment we're in right now. I'll stop there for a moment. I'll stop there.
It's really good to be here, and thanks for inviting us. It's great to be on a panel. I think what I'm going to say is what Yasmin has just said cannot live up to that in a way. So it's really great to hear what you've got to say about that, because I think everybody in the room will be thinking quite deeply and hardly about what's happening, and it's great to have your voice on the panel. In some ways, my background is an illustrator, and after illustrating for many years for the mainstream media, I kind of came from a position that the illustrator's voice is null. And even when you're kind of illustrating for the left, you're still servicing ideas that are made by wordsmiths. And probably slightly unusual to be on a panel that, writing came very difficult to me. I'm probably a bit too old to be tested for dyslexia. It cost a lot of money or whatever, but I'd never read a book until I was about 25, 26, And actually a Scottish friend of mine from the Isle of Skye bought me a book for my birthday and said, read that. And it kind of I said, I don't read books, I don't watch films. I come from what you call a cultural cold place, maybe. And it just opened my eyes to ideas, but they weren't on the left, but it was just it ignited ideas and imagination, and just the power of it is unbelievable. I just kind of thought, why have this world been denied to me? But I do think, after illustrating for many years and then coming to the conclusion and asking questions about it of what I really wanted to illustrate myself, I realised there was nothing there to illustrate in a way. There was no platform for it, and that's where Left Cultures comes from, actually. It's a different model of publishing. It's not publishing from, when you talk, if we expand out from the media for what they're controlling and neoliberalism and what they're controlling, the actual narrative of the gatekeepers is really narrow, and stories do not get told in their fullest, and it's getting narrower and narrower. And we've got to challenge that, and we've got to open those stories up and out. And, I can't claim to say that Left Cultures will ever do it, but we're going to give it a good go. And the variety of voices that are in the book are so wide and from such a wide variety of culture creation. And if we really want to make a difference, and this is obviously just my opinion, we've got to flood culture with left-wing ideas, and we've got to do it, and that's how it's going to open it back out in a way. We've got to be everywhere, and it is a clarion call to people who are on the left. Join in. We can't sit on the sidelines and just expect it to happen. We've got to kind of use our skills and go for it. However, it's a slow burn, and what Yasmin's talking about and what you're talking about is it's got to happen now, and it's really difficult to kind of have a project that's a slow burn when you're like, we've got to do something now, and it's really difficult. But that's where Left Cultures comes from, I think, and it is a slow burn. Jess asked about what a book that really influenced us, and I would have chosen Grapes of Wrath, but I thought I'd better tie it into magazines and all that, so I chose a book called Mertz to Emigre, which is a history of magazine publishing. And it's amazing, the amount of freedom and diversity in magazine publishing that doesn't happen today in that historical book is unbelievable. But I was watching some, kind of previous talks, and a lady, Patricia MacDonald, who might be in the audience, I thought her artwork, her photography is amazing, so I asked her. She found a story a couple of weeks ago, and it was the Grapes of Wrath, and I thought, what a great cultural story that it's like in a circle back to this stage in a way about that. But yeah, I don't think, what we're doing is anything that is in the same ballpark really as what Yasmin's facing, and it's really great to hear those stories, I think.
Thank you so much. And I should mention as well, so yeah, we asked all our speakers this year to tell us of a book that had an influence on the way they view the personal, political, and that interaction, and the ways in which they are the same. And if you just look that way, there's like a wee board behind that pillar where you can add your own kind of reading memories if you would like. So on your way out or as you're browsing, please do that. I wanted to ask you next about, because one of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of like what happens to me or to anyone if I encounter a piece of writing or a piece of art of any kind that has an impact, how does that then translate into actual action? And one of the things that I've been thinking about is community, the fact that reading and often different kinds of art is a kind of isolated activity. So what are the conditions that need to be there in order for people to actually, after they've left the page, organize and find each other, essentially? And that led me to wanting to ask you all three about audiences, actually. So I'll start with you, Yasmin, in terms with Radius. So Radius it's the story of a specific group of organizers with many of their voices in the book. So I wondered how you thought about how the fact that you were working with all these different voices and went to great pains in terms of getting their voices and including them. How did that influence what you thought of, like, who will be reading this and in which context will this be read?
Yeah, well, the voices kind of, I think in many ways, the book happened because I really wanted to have those conversations with people. So I was recording these interviews with people I'd worked with in this group, and volunteers, people, some of them friends, others people I knew far less, some total strangers, because I wanted to have those conversations. I wanted us to think and together, and I wanted to hear about their particular experiences and what they had been also reflecting on in the time since. So that was always kind of be part of the project, even though I wasn't sure what the form would be. And when it came to thinking of audiences, I actually found it, I'll say two things. One is that generally I find it, unless I'm writing like an op-ed or something, like I don't find it particularly useful to think of the reader. I just don't, like, other than just a reader, and so you're trying, in terms of like a person's attention that you're trying to keep while you're telling a story, but like in terms of sort of demography or geography, I find it a little paralyzing to do that, and I think I found it especially so with Radius because of the fact that I was writing about real people who were alive, who were, going to, most of them want to read it when it was done. There was a way that could have been very paralyzing. So that was definitely not something I was imagining. And the other aspect of it, of course, is the baggage that comes with being an Arab writer, writing in English about women in the Middle East. And again, there's a way that can become paralyzing because there is so much baggage, because stories about violence against women in the region get weaponized and turned against, like literally turned into sort of war propaganda sometimes, but also just turned into really, really condescending discourse in which women are only ever represented as these kind of like, victims of their terrible cultures or these kind of, long-suffering heroes. And that was kind of just something I was trying to be mindful about, or maybe even writing against as I was writing. But again, I had a very graceful, or I felt like the story that I was writing about gave me a very gracious way out of that bind, because the story of this group is the story of women being both victims and agents at the same time. And so it kind of like elides that like hard categorization, which can be a trap. So that's it about audiences. I think it's like the way I deal with it in terms of, again, like, you know, writing about the region, writing about gender in the region or violence in the region. In English, for an English reading audience, it's more a sort of an awareness of the history and an awareness of how things could get used, but not having it turn into a sort of silencing effect, you know.
Thank you, Yara. Obviously, yeah, anything that comes to mind. But I also just wanted to mention in There Are More Things, some of you might have read it already, but there are bits that depict organizing meetings where the reader is kind of asked to join in with chants and things like that. And my specific question was like, how did that affect the writing for you? Like imagining that happening and having to sort of, did you ask yourself like, will the reader have an experience of organizing, or like things like that?
So in the book has two narratives. One is historical and set in Brazil during the dictatorship, and the other is set in London in the 2016-2017 kind of period. And the two main characters become friends, and they're both technically Brazilian women, but they have very different experiences of that. One's born in Brazil and comes here as a migrant, the other is from here. And they have different class and race backgrounds as well. And their friendship is built not of a shared identity, but of solidarity and political action together. And there are these moments in the book where the one from Brazil is from this kind of illustrious left-wing family, and Katrina, and then Melissa, the other main character, hasn't been involved in any kind of activism before. And they end up going to this activist meeting that's kind of very loosely based, well, maybe not very loosely, but loosely based on a Sisters Uncut style meeting. But then the kind of political aims of the group are more like lesbian and gay support the migrants, so they're kind of an anti-deportation group. And there's a Hello Kitty iPhone being passed around the meeting, and everyone's asked to read one line of the manifesto of the group. And at the very start of the book, there is something that says, you know, this is a note to you, the reader. When music is played on the page, or when the characters read from the Hello Kitty iPhone, I would like you to play the music or read with them. So there's an instruction from me, the authority of the text, to do that. The reason I wanted to do that was twofold. One is that I wanted to hack and disrupt this idea that you can escape into the world of the book, have a little cathartic experience, pat yourself on the back, and then carry on with your life and not hope for any material change in the world or not act for any material change in the world. I wanted the story of the book and the world of the book to be really linked to the material world. So this isn't a cathartic experience so that you can carry on being passive. This is a way of understanding the world that you live in better. Like, it's instructive. And I wanted to write against this like middle-class bourgeois, like English neoliberal kind of idea of the novel as about like interpersonal empathy and individuals. And actually think about the novel as a sort of like way of moving across time and borders, and again doing that work of expanding the imagination. So that was one of my aims in doing that. And then the other aim in doing that was because I have found being in activist spaces, especially the first time you experience that, and the first time that you speak with hundreds of other people at a demonstration, is initially so cringy, like horribly cringy. Like, why am I repeating rhyming couplets with these people like that I don't know? Like, so embarrassed. And then it's amazing. It's like the most thrilling, meaningful thing you've ever done. And in the story, Melissa does it, and she's so cringed out. She's like, "Oh, what if my boss could see me? What if and then later, like, that is what gives the story meaning, and I hope, like, the novel meaning. So I wanted to recreate that experience in the reader, like, go, be cringed out, but move through to the next bit as well. So I wanted to recreate that experience, and I have lots of readers come up to me and say, "Oh, I'm really sorry, I was reading it on the tube, so I didn't do that." Which I find really funny, because why on earth should you listen to what I say anyway? Like, I'm not there. I can't police whether you have read it out loud or not. So that was what I was trying to do, is to do those two things in that way.
It's nice to see that you're, using the second person in your narrative structure as well, which is always commendable. With audiences, it's an interesting question in a way, and the aim of left cultures is to unashamedly celebrate the left and the good things about the left, and we've made some amazing culture in our history, and we want to celebrate it. Those, what Yara said about neoliberalism closing down ideas is exactly what we have come to the conclusion of as well, which I'm sure many in the room have as well. So when we think about audiences, we launched the first book just over a year ago, and what came back from the sales sheet in a way is that we did really, really well in independent magazine shops. There's a really great guy who runs Mag Culture called Jeremy Leslie, and I've known him for many years, and he kind of said, "Phil, I can't start this. It's not a magazine." I said, "Why do you think that?" And I said, "Do you agree with the politics?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Come on, stock it." It sold 50. And what we found is it did much better. It did so much better in independent magazine shops and almost normal bookshops than radical bookshops. And that was really cool to find that, because we were getting into a new space. That's what I took from that in a way. Not to say that it's not done well in radical bookshops, and we love the support that Lighthouse gives us and all that, and other radical bookshops, which are amazing places, and that was great, because to get into sort of new audiences. So some independent magazine shops have said to me, "Look, we're not political. We might not stock it." But actually, they've been really political by not stocking it. Although I don't say that to them, I try and use a different argument. But they are, they use lifestyle magazines and consumer magazines, which are pretty, you can't get a much more right-wing kind of outlet. But they have given it a go, a lot of them. And we've trying to make left-wing ideas through personal storytelling accessible, And I could sit here for 2 weeks if you want, and you could listen to me slag off the Tories, or whatever, but, we're not going to get anywhere. Whereas, hopefully, by 50 people in each issue, telling their story about what makes them tick culturally, what triggered them, what they found exciting, what they found rewarding, and the illustration, hopefully, is really exciting, and it's a visual feast, but it's also leaning into the left, the histories and the cultural histories of visual communication on the left, which the right-wing media used to demonize certain topics, and they've done that for a very long time. Well, we're kind of trying to reclaim that back and say, look, this is a positive visual language, So we're using it as a vehicle for a lot of things. I don't know whether that's answering your question about audiences, but it does get into a different space, and that's exciting, And it's great when radical bookshops sell it as well, but it's cool to get into that sort of independent magazine place where perhaps you've got a lot of people who are creatives who think they're left-wing, go to the ad agency, sell products, go home, think themselves a bit smug and say, "Oh, I'm left-wing," and then don't do anything. Well, actually, they might be seeing culture being created all over the place, not just visually, and thinking, hang on a minute, I need to get involved here. I started my journey thinking this, and I've kind of got a bit off track or whatever. So I don't know if that's what the aim of it is, but it's certainly the audience feedback or from what we've found has been that. I don't know if that's a bit of a boring statistic kind of answer. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that is really, really interesting. I wanted to go back to something that, well, you mentioned it first, Yasmin, in terms of the mainstream and dominant cultural spaces, and I'm thinking about the publishing industry, for example, and Yara's written a really great article a while ago about the sort of romantic dream of being published, and then how that's changed for you, and the material conditions within the publishing industry. So I wanted to ask you, all three of you, how this industry that you are working in, and it varies for the three of you a little bit, and what you keep learning about it at this moment in time, how is that actually impacting what you're writing and how you're engaging with it and the choices that you're making at this moment in time? And I'll let anyone who would like to answer first go for it.
Yeah, so I would say go and read this article I wrote. I think I laid it out quite well, actually. And I could fill like the whole of the book fair with rants about the publishing industry. And I'm actually really lucky. So how am I meant to find time to write the next one? Like, I obviously need a job as well. And I'm lucky to have a job that's like remote and flexible, but also takes up a lot of my brain, obviously, because it's work. But yeah, like I said, unionization rates are really they're really low. The Society of Authors, our union, sort of acts like an NGO. I don't think it's ever considered asking us to strike or something like that. And there's not a good understanding among authors of why they should be in a union. And the importance of being in a union is not just all of the obvious things, but also because publishing is so consolidated. So when I say consolidated, what I mean is a few companies own most of the imprint. So when you go to a bookshop and it says that this one's published by Virago and that one's published by Abacus, Abacus and Virago are both owned by Little Brown. Little Brown is owned by Hachette. And, so in the article I talk about my novel being on submission to all these different editors. And then when I finally signed with an editor, I go into this big glass building on the banks of the River Thames. It has a roof garden. We go up the lift, and all the names of all the different companies that my book has been submitted to, each floor is a different one because they're all owned by the same parent company, and it drives down advances. And what it means is that there is the incentive for different imprints to compete with each other is less. It drives down wages, it drives down advances for authors, but also it means that the big company can say, oh, we think we've paid, Richard Osman or J.K. Rowling loads of money for their latest book. We're going to invest the marketing budget in that. And it doesn't matter if your book was better or more interesting or more radical or more experimental. They've decided that's where they're putting the resource. There isn't like a level field for competition. Like, books are not all created equal. And so if you're doing something experimental, the received wisdom is that experimental stuff doesn't sell, so we're not going to invest in it. Readers aren't given a choice, really, to see what they actually prefer. So what you have is a situation where capital is really organized in publishing and labor is not very organized at all. And similarly, publishing staff are not, they're getting more unionized after the HarperCollins strike in the US, but it's still not very militant, very cozy with management. So I've actually slightly lost the thread of the question, but the situation in terms of the power that capital has, how consolidated it is, and I haven't mentioned smaller publishers, but hopefully I've created a picture where you can see why it's quite hard for them to compete. And also, book selling is so consolidated. It's basically all owned by the Daunt guy now, and their computers don't even work. It's insane. They have one job, which is to sell books. And the whole of this year, they had a situation where booksellers couldn't even check what books were in stock because they had this fuck up with their computer software. So, we should all join our unions and get militant in them, is the TLDR.
I'm thinking as well, though, obviously there's a reason to unionize as creative workers in terms of changing the industry, but also going back to what you were saying, Yasmin, in terms of actually changing the silence. So, for example, within the publishing industry in the UK, there's been a resounding silence in terms of Palestine. There is absolutely nothing. There's a few very small publishers that have said something, but nothing else. So I wonder if you could speak to that part of things a little bit, and how knowing what, the challenging the mainstream channels, and
I think the key to that is kind of remembering, even as we, operate and work and maybe publish on the margins or in on alternative platforms, that these are not like hard thresholds, right? And we all kind of know or have family or friends or whatever, people who work in mainstream institutions, most likely. You have ways of reaching them. And I think it's important to remember that these places are made up of individual people, many of whom are probably feeling quite conflicted and quite, I know many of them are feeling actively silenced, and some are trying to push back, and you've seen some walkouts, you've seen some statements, but not nearly at the scale that's needed. These places need to sort of tremble. So I guess I would think, that we need to kind of just remember that there's like a permeability that exists through like just the fact that we live in the same societies, and then speaking to the conglomeration of publishing, I mean, it still holds in that case, but like there's also just such a it's such an impoverished imagination. I think especially when it comes to like how the sort of what is expected of readers, like the readers that they anticipate are in the market who want to read, fiction or nonfiction from the Middle East. Like, what are they looking for? It's very, one of you said something about the narrowness of neoliberal thought and imagination. It's very narrow, it's very impoverished. And there's a sort of, I think especially when it comes to publishing books or stories from other parts of the world, there's kind of like a vicious cycle where publishers think readers only want one thing, and they want it to be told very simply, like they can't hold complexity, and so then they only buy and sell books that are simple. There's like a sort of flattening that happens over time, and on that I would actually really recommend, there's a novel actually called, very slim, beautiful novel called If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English by Noor Naga, that's who's also a poet, an Egyptian Canadian poet, and it does a wonderful job of through a project of metafiction, kind of asking some of these questions of like, how does the publishing industry deal or not with stories from elsewhere, which is very tied up with this kind of centralization and conglomerization.
Phil, any thoughts on that? How do you operate in all of that?
I think it's really interesting to hear what you've just said there, because you're creating a kind of socialist novel, but it is in the modes of production that are capitalist. Now the interesting thing is that they're still publishing socialist literature, but they are kind of a capitalist organisation, and they wouldn't maybe claim to be anything else. I don't know. But the modes of production for all left-wing publishers that I can see are still using that model. And we don't use that model. Like, we won't change a word of what's written other than a proofread. It's not up to me to decide what's written by the writer. It's an equal platform. It's the same with the illustrator. What do you want to draw about this? We don't want you to just think who our readership is, what's our agenda, all that. You express yourself, and that's good enough for us. And if you need some help and some art direction, I'll bring it out with you a little bit. So we don't, our editorial standpoint is a heterarchy, and that's the way we try and look at it. I drew a diagram of the model production of editorial publishing, and that goes into books as well, obviously. And it's so hierarchical, it's unreal. Whereas we're trying to create a heterarchy which enables people's voices to come out. And it's really amazing, actually, that we were lucky enough to have Jason Williamson write a story from the Sleafords. And obviously he's really confident in writing music, but he had so little confidence in a way of writing a story, and it was a brilliant story. And he just could not believe that we said, that's great. But if you think about the way that any hierarchical organisation would have got him to be involved, they would have interviewed him and then gone back, edited it to get their message of what they want from that, and it had been curated from a hierarchical or a capitalist position. So what he said is what we put in there, But it was chuffed to bits, and it was amazing, really, because we were thinking, we're chuffed to bits that you've written something. But there's an illustrator is a friend of mine. I used to work with him teaching. We gave him a story, and we said, what do you want to do? And we asked for one illustration. He came back with 40, and he was saying, I've never had this before. This is unreal. And he's kind of middle-aged guy who's kind of been an illustrator for 20-odd years, So I think in a way that's where I said earlier that I was thinking, what do I want to do here? When I worked for left-wing organisations, it was still in this hierarchical sort of servicing model, even though, what you came back with, they'd treat it differently, but it was still in this, So I think, in a way, if we want to change it, perhaps we've got to change the model of production a bit that aligns with the way we think about the world anyway, and you get some different things coming out. I don't know whether or not it'll work, but I think, what we've done with the book does show that it works in a way.
Yeah, I completely agree. And actually, the TLDR of what I said earlier isn't just join your union. It's join your union now and build towards a worker-owned means of production, where the people involved in making the physical object of the book are collaborators, and there's not just the author talent who's underpaid, but everyone's oh, you're so talented, and then the exploited assistant editor and then the editorial boss. But yeah, thank you.
I mean, that's an interesting, there are worker co-op magazines coming through on the left, but I would still say that they operate in, they're owned by a cooperative, everyone's got a stake in it, but actually the way they're made is probably quite vertical still, and it's kind of interesting that you think, we want to live in a different society, but perhaps we need to imagine through our actual creativity or the way we produce stuff and put those mechanisms into practice that will come out differently, and then the product itself will be different. That we, who knows what that would be, and it'd be quite exciting for one. It'd be nice to work on. You know what I mean? So I think there's kind of things we can do a little bit.
I think we're getting to the time where we're going to invite audience questions and questions from online as well. Does that mean yes? Yeah, okay. I have a final question first. So if you've got kind of a half-formed question, this is the time to sort of get it together, and then we'll invite it in. There's a wonderful is not it. It was a really striking bit of your book, of Radius, where towards the end of the revolution, there's a period of time where you talk about not being able to finish sentences, and kind of almost that feeling of language just not being there and not being enough. And that just really struck with me for two reasons. Partly the thing itself, but also the way you end that not trying would be a kind of death. And I've really come back to that because I think it holds true for organizing and for activism as much as it does for creative output and for trying to express what we feel about the world. So that actually will lead me to a question eventually, and it is, what do you reach for when words aren't enough? Oh gosh. Terrible, terrible question, sorry. Or what kind of stories do you reach for at the minute is another way to ask it, maybe.
Do you mean what kind of culture are we looking for, and what kind of culture?
Yeah, or what kind of, because it can be stories in any shape or form. What kind of stories are you needing at this moment in time? This is a slightly different question, but maybe one that is slightly easier to answer.
I think right now, I mean, I said something about these useful histories at the start of the talk, and so I am now at this particular moment, a month in to this horror. I'm reaching for writers like Ghassan Kanafani, who wrote a lot of fiction set in Palestine and had a very expansive and, again, an internationalist vision of liberation and of the Palestinian struggle. And I'm actually reading in particular this, which I'm going to plug to you all. It's a new translation of, it's about 100 pages long, so sort of a long essay by him on the Arab uprisings of 1936 to 1939. It's called The Revolution of 1936 to 1939 in Palestine. It's been available online, like a sort of activist translation of it has been available online for a while, but this is a new one, and it's just published. And it's, he's a structuralist, he's a materialist, he's an internationalist. It's great for sort of, again, situating this moment within its long history and also allowing us to see a way out. And the fact that he was such an internationalist then leads me to also say that I think I have a hope that in terms of people who are in solidarity with Palestine and all of these different actions and movements that are coming together around the world, that Palestine is not seen as a kind of endpoint. It's actually kind of a way through. Like, solidarity with Palestine is a way through to other struggles, other concerns, other urgent engagements, be it about class or race or gender. So there's that, and then of course just in moments of despair, which I think this is not the time for despair, but we all have to struggle with it because just what is happening is so horrific. I also find myself reaching a lot for just the long, Audre Lorde and a lot of Black feminist writers who speak very explicitly about needing to speak, and that actually in moments, in these moments of struggle, or I'm going to again say this is a world-changing moment that we're in, fearlessness is actually a luxury. Fear is there. It's just that's like just the condition of being alive and engaged right now. And so to speak through it and to speak with it and alongside it or even about it is just part of the work. And so I find that tradition, especially of Black feminist writing, to be just rich and really a source of comfort right now.
Thank you. In the last month, I found it genuinely really excruciating and annoying to interact with media of any kind that isn't acknowledging what's happening in Gaza. I found it just, even if it's not being dishonest, sometimes I just felt like that's what's in my mind, and that's what I want to engage with and read about. But I think you're right. Obviously, I'm being present to what's happening in terms of all the death and the atrocity is important, but also I ended up going on this Edward Said YouTube binge. It just kind of happened because which I wouldn't usually recommend if you're poorly on the sofa, but I think I needed something that was look, there is hope, there is a way through, this is a long struggle, yes, what you do right now matters, but also this is a collective struggle, and the failure belongs to all of us, and similar the victories, it's not Yara's failure, that's ridiculous, but yes, I have to show up because of part of the collective struggle. And yeah, so engaging with stuff that reminds us, like, look, this is a long intergenerational struggle, that gave me strength. And I agree with you, like, that's what we need to have. So that has also been like a balm to the feeling of tiredness and hopelessness, but also, given me a sense of, like, this is a collective burden and responsibility. But also, sometimes I found a way to listen to the Harry Potter audiobooks that doesn't give J.K. Rowling money. So when I need, my comfort listening, I go there.
Can I just add something quickly, Phil? Yeah. Because I was very focused on books and texts and past voices and so on. But of course, the most actually cathartic and uplifting thing is, and the culture that I want to be in and see is the people in action right now. And so the organizing has actually been the most sort of soothing thing to do. That's when I felt the best, is when I've been completely wrapped up in organizing different things. And then and I do find myself sometimes going back and watching clips of people who've been speaking at rallies or, you know, leading direct actions or something, and that is culture in action, you know. So yeah.
I think, like, some, you know, engaging with culture, but one of the things I've really enjoyed, sort of like, you know, that's come to light through doing the book, I suppose, like, or the books, is the stories about what culture has done. And sometimes I think when you create culture, and of course direct action is culture, and all forms of culture add to the mix in a way that, you know, help form a culture we want. But, you know, the Ragged Trouser Philanthropist, which is the first working class novel from the worker's position, which, if you think about that, that's absolutely nuts, like, in a way, that is so overlooked. And, you know, he had a pauper's grave and never made a penny from it, although he was a great artist himself or whatever. But it was on the cabinet ministers, it was in the cabinet room's desk when they formed the welfare state. And that was a piece of fiction that went in to help form policy. So, you know, I think that does show that, you know, kind of, and you know, he never knew that, and he probably, like, you know, kind of maybe was disappointed at the impact. And it's really impossible to judge the impact. But when you do put stuff out there, and you're brave enough to do it, you never know where it's going to go and what it's going to do. And those kinds of stories, I think, are really hopeful in a way. And, you know, they are around, and you know, and we can see that has made a direct impact. Now, obviously, that's a slow burn, and a lot of, like, cultural creation is a slow burn. We ain't, you know, I can, you know, we can obviously all aware of how, you know, action is needed immediately. But looking at it in broader terms, we've got to kind of keep fighting on all our different levels. And, you know, when people are creating culture, when you stand up, it can be a really radical act to paint a picture or even just sit down a pub and argue. But you've got to kind of do it, like, you know? You've got to kind of, like, just not, you know, not sit there and just let it pass you by and whatnot and stuff. But it is a slow burn. It is a collective struggle. It's going to take a long time. But it's not going to get anywhere unless we don't facilitate every area of society and, you know, kind of create culture. And it is hard. But you asked us, you know, what you're looking at. I really like those sorts of stories where you know there's been a direct impact from, you know, a book written or a film made or whatever. I think those are, you know, they're great stories anyway themselves. Like, you know, and that's what I think as well. What stories looking at? We're making third edition, and the stories that are coming in are amazing. There's just some amazing direct action stories as well. I mean, I won't go into detail because I'll probably end up talking for, like, you know, till about 12 o'clock. But you know, that's one of the differences from the first two to the third, is we've got direct action being spoken about, and it's amazing stories of bravery, and, you know, it's great actually. But I like those.
Thank you so much. I know that we're sort of a bit over time, sorry, but do you have any questions in the audience that you would like to ask? Or do you have any questions online? I don't know who's taking the online questions. Nor? I don't know how far over time we are, actually. It's not that bad. It's okay. Yeah. You're okay? Okay. Well, I think we're actually almost ending on time. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been such a privilege and just like, yeah, nourishing, I think, for sure.
Thank you. And I wanted to say also, when I was like a baby activist, like I heard about the Anti-Sexual Harassment project in Egypt during the revolution, and this was when I was just getting started in like anti-domestic violence direct action, and I heard about you and how amazing you are. So yeah, it's really cool to meet you and be here.
There you go, a bit of culture in action there, which is nice to see.
A round of applause for our speakers. Thank you so much.